The Sony ZV-E1 might be the best video camera for the money. It has the same specs as a professional camera, but it's cheaper and smaller and with features that are actually better for content creators and hobbyists, making this the perfect camera for a lot of you guys. However, it does have one issue that might be a deal breaker for some. So what exactly are these amazing features in the Sony ZV-E1? And is this camera right for you? Also, I'll leave links down below for the best possible pricing on the ZV-E1. So why exactly is the ZV-E1 such a special camera? The main reason a lot of people want to check out this camera is because it has the same sensor as the very popular Sony a7S III and the Sony FX3, which are both professional cameras that actually cost twice as much. The main reason most people want to check out these cameras is for that 12 megapixel full frame sensor. And this sensor is one of a kind in the camera industry, and in the last 5 years, no one has even come close to how awesome it is. By having 12 megapixels on a full frame sensor, you actually end up having larger pixels. And by having larger pixels, each pixel is able to capture more light. And because of the unique pixel structure of the Sony sensor, which is known as back illuminated sensor, it also makes this camera really, really good in low light. And by this, I mean you have a dual native ISO of 800 and 12,800, which means you can shoot as high as 12,800 without getting any grain in your image. But one thing to note, you have to either shoot at 800 or 12,800. Everything in between will have grain. And if you shoot on the right picture profile, you can even go as high as 16,000 ISO, which is really impressive. But the ZV-E1 is more than just a good low light camera. With this sensor, you also get an incredible amount of dynamic range, which is going to make your video footage look professional and like it's from a pro camera rather than some cheap budget camera. And it's definitely going to help your videos stand out. And one really awesome feature in the ZV-E1 that's actually not present in the a7S III or the FX3 is the Sony AI-based autofocus. The camera already has a ton of data on how to track different subject matters like people, animals, planes, and cars, and so it knows exactly how to track that subject matter, which leads to really sticky autofocus, and it's also extremely reliable. This way, no matter what you're shooting, the autofocus is pretty much just set it and forget it. If you're a professional or just a hobbyist, you're going to get very reliable autofocus, and it's going to make using this camera that much easier. So by now, you probably believe me when I say the ZV-E1 is a gorgeous camera. Now, apart from just having a pretty image, there's a lot of other things that the ZV-E1 does and why a lot of people are picking up this camera. When it comes to video, the ZV-E1 shoots in 4K video, but it shoots at 24, 30, 60, all the way to 120 frames per second in gorgeous 4K. And it does all of this without cropping the sensor or degrading the video quality in any way. So you get really high fidelity video throughout the entire frame rate range. And on top of that, you also have full HD video at 120 frames per second and 240 frames per second, giving you pretty much every frame rate you could possibly want in a video camera. And this makes the ZV-E1 a really versatile camera. If you're a vlogger, a content creator, you're going to get exactly the frame rates you want, but you could also use it to shoot high-end fashion commercials, sports commercials. You can pretty much do any kind of creative work you want with this camera. On top of that, the ZV-E1 also doesn't have a record limit, but it does have some issues with overheating that I'll talk about later. And the ZV-E1 is also going to give you ultra smooth handheld footage thanks to its in-body stabilization, but it also has active stabilization, which gives you pretty much gimbal-like results. It doesn't even show your footsteps. So if you want to take this camera and just use it in handheld mode without any sort of gimbal or support rigging, you could easily do that and get ultra smooth results. And the ZV-E1 also lets you live stream at 4K resolution at 24 and 30 frames per second. So not only is this a great camera, but also a really good webcam. And one thing that really surprised me about the ZV-E1 is that usually when companies make a more creator-friendly or more budget-friendly model of their professional camera, they usually have some sort of compromise in data rates. But the ZV-E1 has the exact same video codec and data rates as the a7S III and FX3. So you get anywhere between 200 megabits per second to 600 megabits per second of data, but you also get the H.264 codec, which is much easier to edit on older and slower machines, so you don't need to have the latest and greatest laptop to edit this camera. And by having such high data rates, you're also going to get much more flexibility when it comes to color grading and editing your footage. And speaking of color grading and editing, Sony has obviously given you all of the picture profiles that are pretty much standard in every Sony camera. So you get S-Log2, S-Log3, and S-Cinetone. But Sony's also put in another new thing in this camera that other cameras that are more expensive than this do not have, and that is cinematic vlog mode. Sony's actually put in a bunch of different custom LUTs that you can even customize inside the camera, and you can get this really cool cinematic image or straight from the camera without any editing. Now, there is one problem where Sony adds these black bars to the top and bottom, which I personally don't love, and I don't think most vloggers want to present their content like that on YouTube, but I think it's a really useful tool for travel filmmakers, someone that's maybe a content creator for a small company, and you just want to get a cool cinematic look in camera, saving you time and money when it comes to editing. And just in case you don't like the way cinematic vlog mode looks, or you just hate the black bars, you can even upload your own custom LUTs into the ZV-E1, meaning you can pretty much create your own custom look, upload it into the camera, and the video from the camera will look exactly like that. And the ZV-E1 also has this one really interesting feature that I think content creators are going to love, and that is AI-based auto reframing. This is where your camera actually locks onto whatever subject is in the video and actually tracks it throughout the frame as it moves about. This way, it kind of looks like you have a cameraman. Personally, I think this is something that most content creators may not use, but I think it's a really useful tool for auto reframing your videos if you're planning on doing any kind of vertical content. So the ZV-E1 pretty much has the exact same video specs as the A7S III or the FX3, but there is one thing missing. The ZV-E1 does not have raw output to an external recorder. You're not really going to need this feature unless you're shooting commercials or something really serious with video, and it's probably not the feature to look for in a content creator or hobbyist camera. Now, if you're a photographer, we should probably address the elephant in the room, and that is the megapixel count on this sensor. A lot of people are going to think that by having a lower resolution 12 megapixel sensor, you're inherently going to get worse image quality. And that's simply not true. You're going to need higher resolution if you want to zoom into your image, or if you want to go in there and edit every little fine detail in your imaging. But for most people just shooting on social media, posting YouTube thumbnails, you're going to be just fine with 12 megapixels. The only thing you're losing is the ability to zoom in, but with 14-bit RAW, which is present in the ZV-E1, you're going to get the same amount of color flexibility, the same amount of dynamic range that you would get with a 33 megapixel camera. But there is one area where the ZV-E1 actually has an advantage over a high resolution camera, and that is the fact that it can shoot 10 frames per second in 14-bit RAW, but it has a really large frame buffer, which allows the ZV-E1 to shoot 999 RAW photos or JPEGs in a row, meaning this camera can pretty much shoot forever. So if you're shooting large periods of action, or you don't know exactly when the action is going to happen, this camera is going to be a better fit than a high resolution camera that can only shoot for a second or two before it needs a break. So you might be wondering, if the ZV-E1 has the same sensor and processor, why are people paying double the price for an A7S III or FX3? And what am I missing with the ZV-E1 that I would get with those more expensive cameras? Well, the main difference between these cameras really comes down to design. And that's also where the ZV-E1 has an advantage for hobbyists and content creators, because the ZV-E1 was specifically designed with those people in mind. The design of the ZV-E1 is ultra minimalist. It's one button to go between photo, video, and slow motion, and one button for video record, and one button for taking photos, and that's it. There's no complicated mode dial. It's a really easy camera to just pick up and start shooting. And the ZV-E1 also has a side articulating screen, but the screen also has touch control. So not only can you control your camera using touch controls for shutter, aperture, and ISO, you can also change all of your major settings like resolution, frame rate, autofocus, and it's kind of like a smartphone if that's what you're used to. The ZV-E1, however, does not have a joystick for moving around your autofocus points, but once again, you have a great touchscreen, so you also have touch autofocus. One thing that is missing from the ZV-E1 is the viewfinder, which some of you guys might hate, but instead of a viewfinder, you actually get a built-in microphone. And this microphone gives you super solid audio because it's a 3-capsule microphone that also lets you pick the direction, so you can get audio from the front or the back, and this way you don't get more than what you want. And the audio from this microphone is super solid, even in noisy environments.
I'm in Times Square. If you can hear me here, you can hear me anywhere, so let me know how the audio is.
Told you, super solid. With this microphone, not only are you going to save money by not having to buy an external microphone, but it's also going to keep your camera much smaller for vloggers and travel filmmakers. One thing to note is that the ZV-E1 only has one SD card slot. For a content creator camera like this, I think it's totally fine. You really don't need 2 SD card slots. But for those of you who are a little bit more on the professional side, you guys might want redundant copies or simply to be able to keep photos on one card, video on one card. Sadly, that's not a feature in this camera, but it is present on the A7S III and the Sony FX3. Now, one issue with the ZV-E1 is overheating. With this smaller body, you don't have a fan, And on long record periods, you will get overheating warnings with this camera. But it's really not that bad if you're a content creator and you're not shooting for more than 20 minutes at a time. At 4K at 24 frames per second, you'll get anywhere between 36 to 40 minutes. At 4K 60, you'll get slightly less at about 32 minutes. At 4K 120, you'll get significantly less at only about 5 minutes. But 4K 120 isn't really something where you need to shoot for more than 5 minutes. However, this is a completely fixable problem. Camera brands have actually started making an external fan for this camera. You can get one anywhere between $36 to $70 depending on what brand, and this way you're actually going to be able to record 4K at 24, 30, and 60 for an unlimited amount of time. So unless your camera actually overheats, you can keep recording. And the $70 fan is definitely going to be cheaper than upgrading to an A7S III or an FX3. Thankfully, the Sony ZV-E1 still uses the large capacity Sony Pro style batteries that are going to give you several hours of video and thousands of photos on a single charge. And the ZV-E1 can also be charged via the USB-C port, so you don't always have to have your charger on you. And the ZV-E1 also only has a micro HDMI cable, not a full-size HDMI cable. And I know most people hate micro HDMIs, but you could easily get a cable lock for the side of this camera, and your cables will be just fine. So who exactly is the ZV-E1 for and who it's not for? The ZV-E1 is perfectly designed for content creators, vloggers, hobbyists, and someone who just wants the resolution, the photo speed, the look of the FX3 or A7S III, but you want it at half the price. Plus, you're going to get these really awesome features like cinematic vlog mode, AI autofocus, which I love, and AI-based reframing, plus that really awesome built-in microphone. And again, it's coming at half the price. So you're going to get an amazing camera package. The only people that probably shouldn't pick up the ZV-E1 is someone that's doing hardcore professional work, but if you are worried about overheating, you can simply add the fan. Overall, I think the ZV-E1 is a much better buy than the A7S III or the FX3 for most people, simply because it comes at half the price. And if you want to make sure you get the best possible pricing on your ZV-E1, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.